Gents, we're here to discuss the evolution of storytelling together. It's one of the most ancient things known to man, and yet in today's marketing world, we seem to have come to a point where we freeze whenever the topic comes up. You have an audience here of marketers and agency folk. It's always been central to great advertising, but only a great story that engages consumers can really create a great brand, and a great story will spread fast. I'd just like to start with you, Todd. Can you describe for us the stories that you tell and the place and the purpose that you feel that you have for yourself in the world?
My films, in some sense, are a response to much that is out there in the media and television and so forth, but it's approached in a way that's very different from what we see in popular culture.
Yeah, news is based on things that perhaps we don't want to talk about between us around the dinner table at night. I mean, James, how does that affect the way that you put out stories for your brands, for example? I mean, doesn't that bounce off the same set of principles?
You started off this by saying, Todd, great stories that people then talk about, and I think we're finding now there's a merger in some of the best advertising, which is put a controversial point of view out there, put it out there with feeling and spirit, and then people will discuss it as well.
Yeah, so I agree with that. But in your world, of course, the media, to an extent, comes first, whereas in Todd's world, Todd, I mean, how do you put a story together? I mean, is there an audience to consider? You don't have a media plan to consider, like James says? I mean, where do your stories come from?
I just sit at home with a pen and paper, and I start from there. The audience that I have to please first and foremost always is myself. And in some sense, I think it even applies, I would imagine, to a successful advertising campaign. You have to, in some sense, fall in love with the story that you're telling, the point of view that you have to convey. And if you don't embrace it, if you don't fully engage on that level, I don't think it'll be very convincing or successful for others.
Certainly in marketing there has to be some sort of affinity, surely.
That's true. It's interesting though, one of the first questions we ask now when we see work presented to us is it authentic? And that's a question we ask more before we ask, will people like it? And quite often I find I'm more than prepared to run work that I know some people won't like.
But do you see yourself more as a crusader for the sort of the dark corners of society? I mean, is that your mission?
I would never call myself a crusader.
You're not dressed like one, I have to
don't
say.
even like the word, but you try to recognize certain truths that aren't being expressed in the worlds of that you feel you have something to say, and hope that there are others who, like yourself, will be moved by the same things that move you.
Yeah.
But I've never had it as my ambition to make films that are massively appealing. I've always been grateful that there's been any audience.
People get confused by two things. First of all, they get confused by which stories to tell about their brands, because most brands have got lots of stories, and I think most brand managers try to tell so many stories at once. There's no clarity, and you lose it. But the second is, I think we're also getting confused by all the wonderful technologies and networks that will be on display this week at Spikes. And I think we can get seduced by the media and not the story. So I think the most important thing is find out the most interesting story that you've got, and then find the most interesting way of telling it. And the media will fit what story you want to do.
So sort of content up rather than media down.
Very much so.
Yeah, I mean, so much does hinge on the power of stories, the stories that are told, and the stories that are forceful and convincing, and have an impact that is tremendously political and cultural. Right now, of course, you have in the United States an election campaign, and you have two competing storylines. And ultimately, the one with the more convincing storyline is the one that's going to win. It's always the one with the better campaign, I think, that always wins the election.
So better campaign vision, better delivered. Doesn't the truth have a role to play in this?
No. even if, as we talked about, actual lies are forbidden and outlawed, it doesn't mean that deception isn't at play at every moment. And it's always about manipulating the audience and choosing what to disclose and what not to disclose.
If we're trying to deceive people as marketers, you get one shot at it. In America, you have to wait 4 years till you get another shot at it for the next president. But I think people buy our products week in, week out, sometimes day in, day out. And you can't fool people like that.
There's a much more honest relationship now, it's a much more open relationship now, very similar to the relationship that Todd has with his viewing public.
I would be flattered if we got anything close to that, but I do think social media keeps you honest. I mean, we can all think of examples of brands who've made over claims, sometimes ridiculous ones, and they found a film on YouTube proving them wrong the following day. So I think to some extent, even if you don't go into it wanting to be telling truths, you're going to have to be, whether you like it or not.
On Corporation Street, how do you measure the effect and the power and the return on investment of a good story? How does that manifest itself?
We have all these techniques so you can see it in sales. What I like is when I see people spending time with our brand online. What I like is when I hear people sharing it, and we've got ways of finding out if people do share the stories themselves and pass them on. What I like is when people retell our stories in different ways.
You could argue at the beginning, though, Todd, that still people used to tell stories around the campfire because of the absence of any other type of media. Is there a need still to tell stories? Surely there's enough out there already. Can't we just piece it together from what's out there? What's the point of a story?
Well, stories were always being invented and reinvented and told and retold with different kinds of meaning. But I think as a filmmaker, and I imagine it applies to advertising as well, on some level when you are thinking of the right kind of story, yes, a point of view is imperative, but also on some level there's an element of fear, I think, that has to come into play. The fear, and to recognize that if you are in fact a little bit afraid, that something makes you a little bit nervous, that may actually be a good thing, a sign of that you're onto something. Because it forces you to question, why am I afraid of making this statement? Why am I afraid to just explore this subject matter? And it also reflects that, therefore, it is not, in fact, something that is discussed or approached in this way. And so a little bit of a fear. Look, you can have no courage without fear. And I think that's what is also needed in order for a story to break through. But it's about pushing it a little bit further so that it opens eyes and ears a little bit more.
So I'd just like to thank you both very much. Todd Solondz, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. And James Thompson from Diageo. Thank you very much indeed, both of you.